story. A poor mechanic repaired a private jet. 3 days later, woman arrived in it and proposed marriage. In the quiet heart of Harmony Creek, a town nestled between rolling hills and a slow-moving river, there was a place that smelled of old coffee, clean oil, and patience. To an outsider, it was just a garage Leo's Auto Repair. The sign outside was hand-painted, its blue letters faded by years of sun and rain. But to the people of the town, and to Leo Maxwell himself, it was a sanctuary. It was a place where broken things were made whole again. Sunlight struggled through the grimy panes of the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden sprites. On a dusty radio perched on a shelf, a classic rock station played softly, a familiar companion to the rhythmic clinking of metal on metal. Every tool had its place on the pegboard walls, their outlines drawn in black marker. They weren't new or shiny. They were worn, their handles smoothed by years of use, each one an extension of Leo's own hands. And in the center of it all stood Leo, a man who seemed as much a part of the garage as the concrete floor. At 30, he had the lean, strong build of someone who worked with their body, not behind a desk. His dark hair had a few premature silver streaks at the temples, and his hands, though perpetually stained with grease that clung deep in the lines of his knuckles, were surprisingly steady and precise. He was bent over the open hood of a cherry-red 1968 Ford Mustang, a car that belonged to the town's mayor and was treated with the reverence of a historical artifact. Leo wasn't just working, he was listening. With his eyes closed, he'd place a hand on the engine block, feeling the subtle vibrations, the rhythm of its mechanical heart. The mayor had complained of a ticking sound, a phantom noise that 3 other mechanics in neighboring towns couldn't find. But Leo heard it. It wasn't a loud tick, it was a whisper, a slight hesitation in the third cylinder's life cycle. "There you are," he murmured to the machine, his voice a low, calm rumble. "Just a little out of breath, aren't you?" He picked up a specific wrench, not too big, not too small, and with a surgeon's focus, made a minute adjustment to a valve rocker arm. The movement was fluid, confident. Born from thousands of hours of practice, he wiped a stray drop of oil from the fender with the sleeve of his blue overalls, then leaned in and turned the key. The engine roared to life, not with a cough or a sputter, but with a deep, even, and perfect purr. The phantom tick was gone. A slow, satisfied smile spread across Leo's face. This was his art. It wasn't about the money, it was about the harmony, the simple joy of setting things right. After cleaning his tools and hanging them back in their designated spots, he walked into the small, cramped office at the back of the garage. The room was a stark contrast to the ordered workshop. A battered wooden desk was covered in invoices, parts catalogs, and a half-empty mug of cold coffee. He washed his hands meticulously at a small basin in the corner, scrubbing away the day's grime with a gritty orange soap until they were as clean as they could ever be. Then, he sat down and pulled a worn cardboard shoebox from the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. The box didn't contain receipts for his business. It was filled with official-looking envelopes, most with the clear window of a medical billing department. They were for his mother, Eleanor. Each one represented a doctor's visit, a new medication, a therapy session. They were a quiet, heavy burden that he carried alone. His mother, a woman with a spirit as bright as a summer sky, was tethered to a body that had been betraying her for years. He picked up the most recent one, his jaw tightening as he saw the amount owed. It was more than he'd made in the last 3 weeks. Pride, a stubborn and deeply ingrained Maxwell trait, kept him from telling her the full extent of their financial struggle. It was his job to fix things, and that included this. He picked up the old rotary phone on his desk and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice a little weak, but laced with its usual cheer. "Leo, honey, I was just thinking about you." "Hey, Mom," he said, forcing a casual tone into his voice. "How are you feeling today?" "Oh, still kicking. The gardenias are blooming right outside my window. It's a good day when you can see the flowers." There was a pause, followed by a soft cough. "Just a bit of a rough morning is all. Don't you worry." "Are you sure? Did you take your new medicine?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Yes, Dr. Maxwell. I followed my instructions," she teased gently. "How are things at the garage? Fixing all the world's problems, one car at a time?" "Something like that," he chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Just hearing her voice was an anchor. Listen, Mom, I'm going to have a good week. That big job for the mayor is done. Don't you worry about those bills, okay? I've got everything else covered. It was a lie, a gentle one, but it felt heavy on his tongue. He had it handled, but just barely. Every week was a tightrope walk between keeping the lights on at the garage and ensuring his mother had everything she needed. You're a good son, Leo, she said, her voice soft with affection. Now, don't let me keep you. Go save another engine. He hung up the phone, the silence of the office suddenly feeling much louder. He stared at the bill in his hand, then placed it back in the shoebox and shoved the drawer closed. He could handle it. He always did. He just needed to work a little harder, a little longer. He was about to head back into the garage when he heard it. It wasn't a sound that belonged in Harmony Creek. It wasn't the distant rumble of a freight train or the drone of a crop duster. This was a shriek. It was a high-pitched, wounded roar that seemed to tear the fabric of the peaceful afternoon sky. Leo shot out of his office chair and ran to the wide-open bay doors of the garage. Outside, others had heard it too. Old Mr. Henderson from the hardware store was standing on the sidewalk, his hands shielding his eyes as he looked up. The Miller twins stopped their bicycles in the middle of the street, their mouths agape. There, against the brilliant blue canvas of the sky, was something that looked like it had been ripped from the cover of a business magazine. It was a private jet, long and sleek, its silver body glinting in the sun like the scales of a predatory fish. But it was in trouble. It was flying far too low, one of its engines spewing a thin trail of black smoke. The powerful, confident roar of a jet engine was replaced by an uneven, sputtering cough that echoed ominously across the valley. It was a silver shark in a goldfish pond, and it was bleeding. Leo watched, his mechanic's mind instinctively diagnosing fuel mixture wrong, injector failure, possible turbine damage. The plane banked sharply, its wings seeming to shudder with the effort as it aimed for the one place it could possibly land. The small, single-strip Harmony Creek airfield, a place more accustomed to single-prop Pipers and the occasional cargo plane. He held his breath, a knot of professional anxiety tightening in his stomach. He watched until the jet disappeared behind a line of tall pine trees in the direction of the airfield. He waited, listening for the catastrophic sound that he prayed would not come. After a long, tense moment, there was only silence. It had made it down. A wave of relief washed over him. He was about to turn back inside when the familiar sight of a dusty, navy blue Ford Bronco pulled up to his garage, its red and blue lights not flashing, but sitting ominously on the dashboard. Sheriff Brody, a large man with a kind face and a perpetually worried expression, stepped out. "Leo," Brody said, foregoing any pleasantries. "You heard that, I take it." "Hard to miss," Leo replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Is everyone all right?" "Seems so. Landed hard, but the landing gear held. No fire, thank God," the sheriff said, adjusting his belt. "But that's where the good news ends. The thing is grounded, and from what I hear, the person on board is... let's just say she's not the patient type." Leo raised an eyebrow. "What's that got to do with me? I fix Fords, Brody, not G652nd. The sheriff sighed, looking from the direction of the airfield back to Leo. "The pilot said they need a certified aviation mechanic, and the nearest one is a 4-hour flight away. The airport manager, old Hank, told them there was only one person in 100 miles he'd trust to even look at a lawnmower engine, let alone a private jet." Brody gave him a pointed look. He told them about our local engine whisperer. Leo felt a strange mix of apprehension and intrigue. He looked at his perfectly ordered garage, a world he understood completely. Then he thought of the wounded, silver machine sitting on the tarmac just a mile away, a puzzle of unimaginable complexity. It was a problem far outside his comfortable domain. "They want me to look at it?" Leo asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "They're desperate," Sheriff Brody confirmed. "The pilot sounded like he was about to have a heart attack, and the owner sounds like she gives them. What do you say, Leo? Feel like taking a look at something a little bigger than a pickup truck?" Leo looked down at his capable, oil-stained hands. He thought of the stack of bills in the shoebox, a problem he couldn't solve with a wrench. Then he thought of the challenge, the pure, mechanical problem of it. A broken engine was a broken engine, and it was his gift, his purpose, to fix them. He let out a slow breath, nodded once, and reached for the worn leather tool bag that had been his father's. All right, Brody, he said, his voice steady. Let's go see the patient. The silence inside the Gulfstream G650 was supposed to be a cocoon of power. It was the sound of billion-dollar deals being made at 40,000 feet, the sound of absolute control. Today, that same silence was a prison. It was the suffocating sound of failure. Isabella Vance paced the length of the plush cream carpet, her $5,000 stilettos sinking slightly with each furious step. She was a vision of corporate warfare, a razor-sharp black dress, a diamond watch that was more a statement of intent than a timepiece, and dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. Her face, usually a mask of calm, calculated authority, was tight with a rage that seemed to vibrate in the air around her. She held her phone to her ear like a weapon. I don't pay my legal team 6 figures a year to hear the word complication, she hissed, her voice dangerously low. The board vote is in 47 hours. This isn't a negotiation. It's a decapitation. When I walk into that room, I want Arthur Vance's proxy votes signed over, his golden parachute shredded, and his portrait already taken down. Am I clear? The tinny voice on the other end of the line squeaked its assurances. Isabella wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed out the oval window at the pathetic sight of the Harmony Creek airfield. It was less of an airport and more of a scar on the landscape, a single strip of cracked asphalt surrounded by overgrown grass and a few dilapidated hangars that looked one strong gust of wind away from collapsing. Her jet, her beautiful, powerful symbol of ascent, sat on this pathetic runway like a thoroughbred horse with a broken leg. The irony was so thick she could taste it. She, who had built an empire on flawless code and zero tolerance for error, was being undone by a mechanical failure in a town that time had forgotten. Liquidate the Henderson position to cover any last-minute persuasion costs, she commanded, turning away from the window. And get Julian Thorne on a watch list. If he so much as breathes in the direction of one of our board members, I want to know. Burn it to the ground if you have to. Just get it done. She ended the call without a goodbye, tossing the phone onto a leather couch. It bounced once before settling into the supple material. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a pilot's uniform entered the main cabin. Marcus had been with her for 7 years, evolving from pilot to head of security, and, in moments like this, the only person on earth she trusted not to lie to her. He had a calm, weathered face that rarely betrayed emotion. Today, it looked tired. Any luck with the manufacturer's tech team? Isabella asked, her tone clipped. They've been dispatched, Miss Vance, Marcus said, his voice a steady baritone. But they're flying out of Savannah. The earliest they can be here with the right equipment is tomorrow evening. Unacceptable, she snapped, turning to face him. Tomorrow evening is too late. The whole point of owning a 21st century miracle of aviation is to avoid being trapped in the 19th century. What about other charter options? Grounded, Marcus replied, holding up a tablet. A severe storm system is moving over the entire region. Nothing is flying VFR, and no IFR-rated jet can land on a strip this short. We're in a weather bubble, and we're the only plane in it. We're stuck. Isabella let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Stuck. Of course. Arthur Vance himself couldn't have planned a more perfect sabotage. Marcus remained silent. He was the only one who knew the full, bitter history with her father. Arthur Vance, a titan of old-world manufacturing, had never approved of his daughter's foray into the vulgar world of tech. He saw her ambition not as a virtue, but as a flaw. Her current hostile takeover of his own legacy company, Vance Industries, wasn't just business. It was the final, brutal checkmate in a game he had started the day she was born. This can't be happening, she muttered, more to herself than to him. She ran a hand over her forehead, briefly letting the mask of control slip. This deal was everything. It was revenge for every dismissal, for every time he'd introduced her as my daughter, who tinkers with computers. It was the culmination of a decade of relentless work, of sacrificing relationships and personal happiness on the altar of her ambition. And it was all going to be torched because of one faulty part. I know the timing is ironic, Marcus said carefully. But it's just a machine, Miss Vance. It's not a conspiracy. Isn't it? She shot back, her eyes flashing. After what Julian did, tried to sell my code to my own father? I've learned the hard way that when things go wrong, it's rarely an accident. Marcus's jaw tightened at the mention of Julian Thorne, the brilliant, charming COO who had stolen Isabella's heart and then tried to steal her company. Julian is a snake and your father is a dinosaur. But neither of them can control the fuel injectors on a Gulfstream. This is just bad luck. I don't believe in luck, Isabella stated, her voice turning to ice. I believe in variables. And right now, the variable I can't control is this town. Find me another option. There has to be someone. Marcus hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. There is one last-ditch option, and you're not going to like it. I already don't like anything about this situation. What is it? I spoke with the airfield manager, Marcus began, looking deeply uncomfortable. An old-timer named Hank. He said the nearest certified mechanic is in Charleston and he can't get here. But he said, and I'm quoting here, if you want someone who can actually listen to an engine, there's only one man for the job. Isabella stared at him, unblinking. Get to the point, Marcus. He's a local car mechanic, Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush as if to get it over with. Runs a garage in town. Hank and the local sheriff swear by him. They call him some kind of engine whisperer. Isabella's expression went from fury to utter disbelief. She stared at Marcus for a full 5 seconds before a laugh, sharp and incredulous, escaped her lips. An engine whisperer? A car mechanic? Are you joking? Marcus, this is a $65 million aircraft with proprietary avionics. Its engine is more complex than the entire power grid of this town. You want me to let some grease-stained hillbilly with a wrench poke around in it? Miss Vance, I told you wouldn't like it, Marcus said, holding his ground. I've exhausted every other possibility. We've run the remote diagnostics with Gulfstream's headquarters. They're baffled. They suspect a cascading failure that the computer can't pinpoint. We are out of conventional options. My professional opinion is that we wait for the specialists. And my professional reality is that I can't, Isabella countered, her mind racing. She hated it. The idea was absurd, insulting. It was an affront to everything she represented: precision, technology, expertise. Entrusting her fate to some local, folksy legend was the kind of thing that happened in sentimental movies, not in the cutthroat landscape of her life. And yet, the image of her father's smug face, celebrating her failure, flashed in her mind. The thought of Julian Thorne swooping in to pick at the bones of her deal made her stomach churn with acid. She would not lose. She would rather bet on a 1 in a million shot than accept certain defeat. She had built her empire by calculating risks and sometimes, just sometimes, by taking a leap of faith on an unconventional solution. She walked to the jet's door and pushed it open, letting the humid, earthy air of the town flood the climate-controlled cabin. It smelled of damp soil and pine needles. It was the smell of the world she had fought so hard to leave behind. She looked at Marcus, her eyes now cold and decisive. The time for anger was over. Now was the time for action, no matter how illogical. What's his name? Leo Maxwell, Marcus answered, surprised by her sudden shift. Get him, Isabella commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. She stepped out onto the top of the stairs, the queen surveying her broken temporary castle. I don't care if he shows up with a hammer and a prayer. Get him here, now. Leo's truck seemed to sigh as he turned off the ignition, its engine sputtering into a final, familiar silence. He stepped out, not with the hurried anxiety of a man summoned by the powerful, but with the steady, measured pace of a doctor approaching a patient. He carried a single, heavy leather tool bag, its surface cracked and softened with age. To him, the Gulfstream wasn't a symbol of wealth or status. It was simply the patient, and it was a magnificent one. He paused for a moment, taking in the sheer scale of the aircraft. Its lines were flawless, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the blue sky and fluffy white clouds with perfect clarity. It was a marvel of engineering, and despite the trail of smoke it had left across the sky, he felt a surge of professional admiration. Marcus watched him approach, standing stiffly beside the open engine, housing like a palace guard. His posture was a wall of skepticism. As Leo drew closer, Marcus's eyes did a quick, dismissive scan. The oil-stained overalls, the worn work boots, the calm, unassuming face. It was worse than he had imagined. You're Maxwell? Marcus asked, his tone flat, making no effort to hide his doubt. Leo. Yes, sir, Leo replied, his voice even. He set his tool bag down on the tarmac with a soft thud. Heard you have an issue. Sheriff said it was an engine. An issue is one way to put it. Marcus clipped back, gesturing toward the complex heart of the jet engine. This is a Rolls-Royce BR-725. The FADEC, the full authority digital engine control, is throwing a dozen contradictory error codes. We suspect a primary fuel injector failure, but the diagnostics can't isolate it. Frankly, this requires a proprietary diagnostic suite you wouldn't have access to. He held up his tablet, its screen filled with complex schematics and scrolling lines of red flag data, as if to prove his point. Leo glanced at the tablet, his eyes taking in the data for a brief second before he looked back at the engine itself. He offered Marcus a polite, small smile. Sometimes the patient tells you more than the chart does. Ignoring the offered tablet, Leo walked directly to the engine. From the stairs of the jet, Isabella watched his every move. She had expected a swaggering, overconfident country mechanic. Instead, she saw a man possessed of a quiet, unnerving focus. He wasn't intimidated by the multi-million-dollar machine. He was curious. He didn't reach for a tool. Instead, he did something that made Marcus's jaw tighten in disbelief. Leo reached out and gently placed his palm flat against the cool metal of the engine housing, just below the intake. He closed his eyes. The world seemed to fall away for him. The gentle breeze, the distant chirping of birds, the tense silence from the two people watching him, it all faded into a low hum. He wasn't just touching a machine. He was connecting to it, feeling for the lingering ghosts of vibration, the memory of the trauma it had just endured. His senses, honed by years of listening to the subtle complaints of pistons and gears, were searching for the one discordant note in a symphony of mechanics. To Isabella, it looked like some kind of mystical ritual, a practice completely alien to her world of data points and profit margins. It should have been ridiculous. Yet, she found she couldn't look away. After a long moment, Leo opened his eyes. He turned, his gaze not on Marcus, but directly up at Isabella, who stood silhouetted against the bright sky. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Right before the engine gave out, what did it sound like? Not what the instruments said. What did you hear? The question caught her off guard. In her entire career, no one had ever asked for her sensory input on a technical problem. She was the one who read reports and analyzed data. Her feelings were irrelevant. But he was asking, and his gaze was so direct, so genuinely inquisitive, that she found herself searching her memory. It hesitated, Isabella said, surprised by the clarity of the recollection. For a split second, the usual roar was gone. It was replaced by a high-pitched whine, then a cough, a deep, stuttering sound, like metal straining not to break. She described it with the same precision she would use in a boardroom, a small part of her impressed with his unorthodox approach. Leo nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was exactly what he had felt, the ghost of a high-frequency vibration followed by a low-frequency shudder. The whine wasn't the engine, he said, thinking aloud. It was the air. He turned back to the engine, his movements now filled with purpose. He unlatched his old leather tool bag, its contents a jumble of familiar, worn-in tools. He bypassed the main fuel assembly that Marcus had been fixated on, and instead reached deep into the engine's auxiliary systems, his arm disappearing into the intricate web of pipes and wires. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus started, taking a step forward. "That's the bleed air system. The FADEC shows it's functioning perfectly." "Machines don't lie," Leo said without turning around, his voice slightly muffled. "They tell you exactly what's wrong, just in their own language. Computers, though, they only speak the language they were taught. If they haven't been taught the right questions, they can't give you the right answers." He ignored Marcus's sputtering protest and focused on a small, almost hidden component, a pneumatically controlled pressure valve, no bigger than his thumb. It was designed to regulate air pressure flowing from the engine to other parts of the aircraft. It was so minor, so insignificant, that the diagnostic system, programmed to look for major failures, had overlooked it completely. But Leo could feel it. The subtle strain in the system led him right to it. It was stuck. Not broken, not fried, just stuck. A tiny, stubborn gatekeeper, causing system-wide chaos. The computer, interpreting the resulting airflow disruption as a fuel problem, had sent them all on a wild goose chase. He pulled his arm out and selected a single tool, a long, heavy-handled screwdriver. He didn't use the tip. He turned it around. "Are you going to hit it?" Marcus asked. his voice a mix of horror and outrage. "No," Leo said calmly. "I'm going to tap it." With a practiced, precise motion, the same kind of motion he'd used on the mayor's Mustang, he used the heavy plastic handle of the screwdriver to deliver 3 sharp, distinct taps to the side of the valve housing. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a violent act, but a calculated one, like a chiropractor making a tiny adjustment to a spine. He heard a faint, almost inaudible click from deep within the mechanism, the sound of something small, stuck, and important being set free. He pulled back, wiping a smear of hydraulic fluid from his knuckles onto his overalls. He looked over his shoulder at the stunned pilot. "Try it now." Marcus stared at him, then at Isabella, who gave a single, sharp nod. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was either the act of a madman or a genius, and she was starting to believe it was the latter. With a look of profound doubt, Marcus walked stiffly back to the cockpit. The silence on the tarmac was absolute. Isabella held her breath. Leo simply stood, waiting patiently, his expression calm. Inside the cockpit, Marcus initiated the startup sequence. The auxiliary power unit whined to life. He hesitated for a second, his hand hovering over the engine start switch, then pushed it. For a moment, there was the same horrible cough. Isabella remembered the engine trying to clear its throat. A puff of black smoke coughed out of the exhaust. Marcus's face fell. But then, something changed. The cough smoothed into a low growl, which deepened and swelled, the whine completely gone. Within seconds, the growl escalated into the powerful, clean, earth-shaking roar of a perfectly healthy, perfectly balanced jet engine. The sound was magnificent. It was the sound of power, of control, of freedom. Marcus stared at the instrument panel in front of him. Every single red flag was gone. The screen was a sea of tranquil green. Engine status, optimal, the display read, as if mocking his earlier certainty. On the tarmac, the force of the engine wash whipped Isabella's hair across her face, but she didn't notice. She wasn't looking at the engine anymore. Her gaze was locked on Leo Maxwell. He stood there, unmoving, a small smile on his face as he listened to the roar he had resurrected. In that instant, she didn't see a car mechanic. She didn't see a small-town man in dirty overalls. She saw a form of power she had never encountered before, not the loud, posturing power of the boardroom, but the quiet, unshakable power of pure competence. In a world of bluff and bluster, this man was real. He hadn't just fixed her jet. He had rearranged her entire understanding of the world. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life had just been irrevocably altered. The roar of the Rolls-Royce engine was the sound of Isabella Vance's world snapping back into its correct orbit. It was the sound of power restored, of a $50 million deal pulled back from the brink, of victory snatched from the jaws of a humiliating, folksy defeat. The sound saturated the air, a physical force that vibrated deep in her bones. After what felt like an eternity, the roar began to subside, spooling down with a satisfying whine until it settled into a low, perfect hum. And then, with a final click from the cockpit, silence. The sudden quiet that descended upon the tarmac was heavier and more profound than the noise it replaced. It was filled with the unspoken shock of what had just occurred. Marcus emerged from the jet, his face pale. He looked from his pristine instrument panel, now a sea of green, to the unassuming man in the oil-stained overalls. He approached Leo, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a deep, undisguised awe. I don't know what to say," Marcus stammered, shaking his head slowly. "The entire diagnostic suite is clean. It's perfect." "How did you know?" Leo was already packing his tools back into his worn leather bag, his movements methodical and unhurried. "You just have to know how to listen," he said simply, offering Marcus a small nod. "She'll fly true now." Isabella descended the jet stairs, her heels clicking decisively on each step. The fury was gone, replaced by a sharp, analytical focus. She was back in her element. A problem had been solved. An asset had performed exceptionally, and now it was time for remuneration. This was a transaction, and she was the master of the form. She stopped directly in front of Leo, who looked up from securing a latch on his tool bag. The sheer contrast between them was almost comical. He was of the earth smelling of metal, oil, and honest work. She was of the air, all sharp lines, expensive perfume, and intangible power. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, her voice crisp and commanding, I have never in my entire career witnessed that level of intuitive expertise. You have done something that a team of specialists with millions of dollars of equipment could not. You haven't just saved my schedule. You've saved a landmark acquisition for my company. She reached into her designer handbag and retrieved a slim, elegant checkbook and a gold pen. The gesture was as natural to her as picking up a wrench was to him. She clicked the pen open. I am a firm believer in rewarding talent, she continued, her eyes fixed on his. So, name your price. Whatever it is, I will double it. Don't be modest. Consider this a consultation fee of the highest order. She held the pen poised over the blank check, ready for the negotiation. This was a game she knew. She expected him to be shy at first, perhaps ask for 10,000, maybe even 50. She was prepared to write a check for $250,000 without blinking. It would be worth every penny to quantify this experience, to put it into a neat column in her life's ledger marked "Problem Solved." Leo looked from the pen to the checkbook and then back to her face. He saw no malice there, just a way of operating so foreign to his own that it was almost abstract. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, not of amusement, but of genuine, gentle confusion. He shook his head. No thank you, ma'am. The three words hung in the air, completely disrupting Isabella's reality. Her hand froze. I'm sorry? She asked, certain she had misheard. I'm not offering a tip, Mr. Maxwell. I'm offering you a finder's fee that could change your life. I appreciate that. I truly do, Leo said, his tone patient and sincere. He picked up his tool bag, its weight familiar in his hand, but the valve just needed a little tap. It wasn't a big job. A little tap? Isabella repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. She looked at Marcus, who seemed equally stunned. A little tap just saved me from a $50 million loss. She said the number as if it were a trump card, a blast of reality meant to snap him out of his folksy delusion. Surely now he would understand. The number, the sheer scale of it, had to mean something. It didn't. Leo's expression didn't change. The figure, which could have funded his entire town for a year, seemed to have no impact on him whatsoever. Well, he said thoughtfully, I'm glad your deal is safe. But I didn't fix a $50 million deal. I fixed an engine. It's what I do. He started to turn away. Wait, Isabella commanded, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. This was not how the world worked. Everything had a price. Everyone had an angle. She couldn't let him just walk away. It felt like a loose thread that could unravel everything she understood about human motivation. You can't just leave. You have to let me pay you something. Your time, your talent. Leo stopped and looked back. He seemed to finally understand that for her, this transaction was a necessity. He considered for a moment, then gave a slight shrug. All right, he conceded. It's about a gallon of gas to get here and back. And I was away from the garage for about an hour. So, let's call it $30. $30. The number was so small, so absurdly, comically small, that it felt like a slap in the face. It was less than she spent on a bottle of water at a hotel. It was a joke. But as she looked into his clear, steady eyes, she saw not a trace of irony. He meant it. She stood there, speechless, the gold pen feeling heavy and useless in her hand. Her entire arsenal of power, her wealth, her influence, her ability to command and acquire was utterly ineffective. It was like trying to threaten the ocean with a fire. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper and a pencil stub. I can just write you an invoice if it makes it easier for your accounting. No, Isabella said, finding her voice. It came out as a whisper. No, that won't be necessary. She watched, mesmerized, as he walked over to his old dusty truck. He tossed his tool bag onto the passenger seat, slammed the door shut, and then gave her and Marcus a final friendly wave before climbing in. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble, and he drove away, kicking up a small cloud of dust as he left the pristine tarmac and returned to his world. Isabella was left standing in the silence, the open checkbook still in her hand. The blank line next to pay to the order of seemed to mock her. Marcus cleared his throat, breaking the spell. Miss Vance, we're cleared for takeoff. She nodded numbly and walked back up the stairs, the strength momentarily gone from her legs. She sank into a plush leather seat, the one she had paced in front of just an hour before. The interior of the jet, usually her sanctuary of control, now felt like a gilded cage. As the jet taxied to the end of the runway and began its powerful, flawless ascent, Isabella stared out the window. She saw the small town of Harmony Creek spread out below her, a patchwork of quiet streets and green trees. She saw the glint of the sun off the roof of a small building she knew must be Leo's garage. Her world of skyscrapers, boardrooms, and global markets felt impossibly distant. She looked down at the blank check in her hand. It was a symbol of her power, a tool that could buy armies, influence governments, and build empires. But it had been powerless against the simple integrity of one man. In a world of complex transactions, he had given her something clear and absolute. He had given her a gift, and in refusing to set a price, he had made it priceless. And in that moment, as the jet climbed higher into the cold, clean air, Isabella Vance, the woman who had everything she'd ever fought for, was consumed by the sudden, aching realization that she had just left behind the one thing she now truly wanted. Isabella Vance stood at the head of a monolithic mahogany table. On the massive screen behind her, the final vote tally glowed in a triumphant green, 78% in her favor. The hostile takeover was complete. The room was filled with stone-faced men in tailored suits. Their polite applause, a stark contrast to the brutal corporate execution they had just witnessed. She had won. She had driven a dagger into the heart of her father's empire and twisted it. This was the moment she had been working toward for a decade. "The motion carries," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. It sliced through the applause, silencing it instantly. Effective immediately, the board of Vance Industries is dissolved. New appointments will be announced by morning. A full operational audit is to begin within the hour. Dismissed. She didn't wait to watch them file out. She turned and looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the panoramic view of the city, a concrete jungle she had just conquered. The victory felt quiet. The adrenaline that had fueled her for the past 48 hours drained away, leaving a strange and unsettling emptiness in its wake. It was done. And yet, she felt nothing. Her mind, instead of savoring the kill, kept replaying a different scene. A man in dusty overalls, smiling as he turned down a fortune. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the world was anything but quiet for Leo Maxwell. The familiar, rhythmic work of his hands failed to soothe his restless mind. He was underneath a John Deere tractor, his arms covered in grease as he wrestled with a seized hydraulic lift. But his focus was gone. Every few minutes he would find himself pausing, his gaze drifting upward, as if he could see through the metal roof of his garage to the sky beyond. He kept listening for the ghost of a sound, the powerful roar of a jet engine. "You're 1,000,000 miles away today," a voice boomed, startling him. Leo slid out from under the tractor to see his oldest friend Dave standing there. Dave was a large, good-natured man who ran the town's feed store, a pragmatist whose feet were planted firmly on the ground. He was holding 2 bottles of cold soda, one of which he tossed to Leo. "Heard you had some excitement out at the airfield," Dave said, leaning against his dusty pickup. "Sheriff Brody's been telling anyone who'll listen that you saved some fancy billionaire's jet with a screwdriver and a prayer." Leo caught the bottle and grunted, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag before twisting the cap. "It wasn't that dramatic, wasn't it?" Dave took a long drink. "Because the other version of the story I heard is that this billionaire offered you a blank check and you told her you'd rather have $30. He paused, his jovial tone fading. "Leo, tell me that part isn't true." Leo avoided his friend's gaze, taking a slow drink of his soda. "The job was worth $30. Dave stared at him, his mouth agape. "Are you insane? Clinically, certifiably insane? I saw the pictures of that jet online, man. That thing is worth more than this entire town. You could have paid off every one of Eleanor's medical bills for the next 20 years. You could have bought this garage and 10 more like it." The words landed like small, sharp stones. They were the very same thoughts Leo had been wrestling with since he'd driven away from the airfield. He looked over at the battered shoebox peeking out from under his desk, a quiet monument to his financial struggle. "It wasn't my money to take, Dave," Leo said, his voice tight. "It was a 10-minute fix. Taking more would have been wrong." "Wrong?" Dave scoffed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "What's wrong is watching you kill yourself working 70 hours a week to barely stay afloat. What's wrong is knowing your mom worries about every single bill. Integrity is a fine thing, Leo, but it doesn't pay for prescription medication. You're a good man, the best I know. But you're a fool. Leo didn't have an answer. He knew Dave was right. From a certain point of view, the logic was undeniable. And as he stood there in the quiet of his garage, the familiar satisfaction of his work felt tainted, for the first time, by the bitter taste of a choice he was no longer sure was the right one. The victory party that evening was held in a sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of clinking champagne flutes and forced laughter. Isabella moved through the crowd like a shark, accepting congratulations with a tight, practiced smile. Brilliant, Isabella. Truly ruthless. Your father must be proud, one rival CEO said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. A masterstroke, another man purred, his hand lingering just a little too long on her arm. We should discuss a merger. Our assets combined, she saw them not as people, but as walking balance sheets. They looked at her and saw a new stock to be acquired, a new asset to be leveraged. It was the language she spoke, the world she had built. So why did it suddenly feel so suffocating? Then, through the crowd, she saw him, Julian Thorne. He was handsome, charming, and utterly venomous. He was the man who had taught her the hard lesson about trust. He approached her, a smug smile playing on his lips. Isabella, he said, his voice smooth as silk. I hear congratulations are in order. You finally did it. You slew the dragon. Julian, she replied, her voice turning to ice. I wasn't aware they let scavengers into this building. He chuckled, unfazed. Still so sharp. I also heard about your little travel delay, a trip to the country. How rustic. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Be careful, Isabella. A newfound sentimentality can be a liability in our world. People might start to think you're going soft. The threat was clear. He would use any perceived weakness against her. She gave him a look that could freeze fire. The only thing that went soft was my father's hold on his company. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a real victory to celebrate, not a past failure to mourn. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. But his words had hit their mark. She fled the suffocating crowd and retreated to the silence of her hotel suite, another gilded cage. She shed her designer dress like a suit of armor and pulled on a simple silk robe. The city glittered below her, a sea of diamonds, but she felt no connection to it. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she opened her laptop. She bypassed the market reports and financial news. In the search bar, she typed 2 words, Harmony Creek. Then, Leo Maxwell. There wasn't much. A simple business listing for the garage. A blurry photo from a local newspaper article about him fixing the town's 4th of July parade float for free. Then she refined her search. Eleanor Maxwell, Harmony Creek. This time, she found it. It was a small community fundraising page from 2 years ago, set up by a local church. It described Eleanor's chronic illness and the mounting medical bills facing her devoted son, Leo. There was a picture of him and his mother, a woman with a tired but radiant smile. He was looking at her with an expression of such profound love and fierce protectiveness that it made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just refused a fortune. He had refused a fortune he desperately needed. His integrity wasn't a philosophical luxury, it was a sacrifice. His refusal to take her money wasn't an act of defiance against her, but an act of allegiance to himself. The $30 he'd requested wasn't an insult. It was all he felt he had truly, honestly earned. She sank back into her chair, the vast, empty suite feeling more like a vacuum than a home. The scale of her victory in the boardroom felt insignificant compared to the scale of his character. The next morning, she walked into what was now her company headquarters. The air was electric with the transfer of power. Assistants scurried, executives looked nervous. She strode into the main boardroom, her boardroom, where her new, hand-picked team was waiting. The transition plan is on your tablets, she announced. All business. I want a full report by... She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes were fixed on the far wall, where a massive, oil-painted portrait of her father, Arthur Vance, stared down at the room with patriarchal disapproval. First, she said, her voice like steel, get that painting taken down. Now, workers were summoned. They brought a ladder and began the careful work of removing the monument to the old regime. Isabella watched for a moment, and her team watched her, expecting a speech, a toast, a moment of triumphant reflection. She gave them none. As soon as the painting was off the wall, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the stunned board members in her wake. She found Marcus waiting by the elevators. "We're leaving," she said. "Of course, Miss Vance," he replied, checking his watch. "The flight to London for the international press conference is scheduled for 3 p.m. "Cancel it," she said, not breaking her stride. "Set a new course." Marcus looked confused. "A new course? To where?" Isabella stopped and turned to face him, her eyes burning with a clarity and purpose that he hadn't seen even in the heat of her corporate battle. "Harmony Creek," she said. "Miss Vance." "Why?" he asked, completely bewildered. "Your work here is just beginning." A slow, enigmatic smile touched her lips. "You're wrong, Marcus," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "I have one more acquisition to make." The sound was a violation. In the 3 days since the silver jet had first torn a wound in the sky, Harmony Creek had settled back into its comfortable rhythm. The story of Leo and the billionaire had already begun its journey into local legend, a tale to be told over beers at the town pub. So when that specific, powerful roar returned, it wasn't just a sound, it was a memory, and it sent a ripple of confusion through the quiet streets. Leo was elbow deep in the engine of the sheriff's Bronco, replacing a faulty alternator when he heard it. He froze, a wrench clutched in his hand. His head snapped up, and he squinted at the sky. There it was, smaller this time, but unmistakable. The G-650. It wasn't trailing smoke. Its flight path was smooth and confident, but it was descending. His first thought, a sharp pang of professional anxiety, was that he had failed. The valve. It must have stuck again. The tap wasn't a fix, just a temporary reprieve. He had been so sure, the thought that he had given false hope, that his confidence had been misplaced, coiled in his gut. He quickly wiped his hands on a rag, his mind already cycling through potential secondary causes he might have missed. He watched as the jet disappeared behind the tree line in the direction of the airfield. He expected a call from the sheriff, a frantic summons back to the runway, but the call never came. Instead, 10 minutes later, a different vehicle appeared at the end of his street. It wasn't the sheriff's Bronco or a dusty pickup. It was a sleek black town car, the kind that looked like it had been teleported from Park Avenue. It moved with a silent, predatory grace down the humble street, its tinted windows reflecting the curious faces of his neighbors, before gliding to a perfect stop right in front of his garage. Leo stood motionless in the wide-open bay door, a strange sense of dread and anticipation mixing within him. The back door of the car opened. It wasn't Marcus who stepped out. It was her. Isabella Vance emerged from the car, and the contrast was even more jarring than it had been on the tarmac. There was no power suit this time, no armor of the boardroom. She wore a simple, sleeveless dress of a deep blue color that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. Her hair wasn't pulled back in a severe knot, but fell softly around her shoulders. She looked younger, less like a commander, and more human. The only remnant of her other life was the palpable aura of intention that surrounded her. She hadn't come here by accident. Leo wiped his hands on his overalls, a nervous habit, and took a few hesitant steps forward onto the driveway. "Ma'am?" he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "Is the jet okay? Did the valve give you trouble again? I can come take another look." Isabella closed the car door behind her, the sound a soft, definitive thump. She gave him a small, sad smile. "The jet is perfect, Leo. It performed flawlessly." She took a step toward him, then another. "It brought me exactly where I wanted to be." She stopped just a few feet from him, close enough for him to see the faint, nervous tremor in her hands. The air between them crackled. This wasn't a client returning with a complaint. This was something else entirely, something for which he had no tools and no diagnostic chart. I don't understand," he said, genuinely bewildered. "Is there something else I can help you with?" "Yes," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I think there is." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a hostile takeover. "For the past 3 days, I have been living out the single greatest victory of my career. I've been surrounded by the most powerful people in my industry, all congratulating me, all wanting a piece of me, all calculating their angles. She paused, her gaze locked on his, and all I could think about was the man who wanted nothing at all. I was in rooms filled with men who collect things, companies, cars, art. People in my mind kept drifting back to the man who finds joy in fixing things, not just owning them. Leo stood frozen, unable to process her words. He felt like an engine being fed the wrong kind of fuel. His mind sputtered, trying to make sense of the data. I went back to New York and I tore down my father's empire, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Each word, a carefully placed stone, building a bridge between her world and his. I thought it would feel like a victory, but it was just demolition. It was just noise. The only thing that felt real was what happened on that runway. The quiet, the focus, the integrity. That felt like creation. She took the final step, closing the distance between them. Now she was standing on the edge of the oil-stained concrete floor of his garage, the threshold of his world. I did some research, she confessed, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. I know about your mother. I know about the bills. And knowing that, your refusal to take my money, Leo, in my world, that kind of character doesn't exist. It's a rounding error. It's a myth. But you're real. Leo could only shake his head, completely overwhelmed. I just did my job. No, she insisted, her voice dropping to an intense, urgent whisper. You showed me what a man of value looks like. Not a man of wealth, a man of value. And I realized that I have spent my entire life accumulating the wrong currency. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Isabella's gaze was unwavering, filled with a terrifying and beautiful vulnerability. She seemed to be looking past the grease and the overalls, past the mechanic, and directly into the core of the man. I came back to close one more deal, Leo, she said, her voice trembling slightly now. The most important one of my life. And then, she did something that shattered Leo's entire understanding of the laws of the universe. In front of his dusty tool chests and cluttered workbenches, Isabella Vance, the newly crowned queen of a corporate empire, slowly, deliberately, knelt down on one knee. The fine silk of her dress pulled around her on the gritty, oil-stained concrete floor. Leo's breath hitched in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm. This could not be happening. From a small, hidden pocket in her dress, she produced a simple, elegant box. She opened it. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was not a glittering diamond but a simple, masculine wedding band made of a brushed, heavy-looking metal that looked like platinum. It was understated, strong, and beautiful. It was a ring that looked like it was meant to be worn, not just displayed. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a terrifying, magnificent resolve. My life is a complex, broken machine, Leo, she said, her voice thick with emotion but steady as rock. It's powerful and it's fast, but it's been running rough for a very long time. I think its heart is missing. She took a shaky breath. I think you're the only one who knows how to fix it. The world narrowed to the space between them. The sound of the birds, the distant traffic, his own frantic heartbeat, it all faded away. There was only the sight of this incredible, impossible woman kneeling on the floor of his garage, offering him not a transaction, but a covenant. Leo Maxwell, she asked, her voice clear and strong in the silence. Will you marry me? For a long moment, Leo was paralyzed. Shock was too small a word for it. It was a complete system failure, a reboot of his entire reality. His mind raced, trying to find the logic, the angle, the catch. There was none. There was only the raw, terrifying, beautiful honesty in her eyes. And in that honesty, he saw a reflection of his own. He saw a woman who, for all her wealth and power, was searching for the same thing he valued, something real, something true. The shock slowly receded, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. A slow smile, a genuine and radiant smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face, began to spread. The anxiety, the confusion, the doubt it all dissolved, replaced by a single, simple, overwhelming certainty. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the impossible image before him. He nodded once, then again, more forcefully. Yes, he whispered, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and said it again, loud enough for the whole world to hear. Yes, yes, I will. The 2 days following the proposal were a whirlwind, a surreal dream from which Leo felt he hadn't yet woken. Their engagement was a secret, a fragile, beautiful bubble they kept just for themselves. He told his mother that he was going away for a few days to help with a specialized consulting job, a half-truth that felt both necessary and deeply inadequate. Then, he was on the G650 again. But this time, he was sitting in a plush leather seat, and Isabella's hand was in his. This time, the destination was New York City. The city wasn't just a place, it was an assault on the senses. Stepping out of the town car into the controlled chaos of Manhattan, Leo felt like a man who had spent his entire life in a quiet library and was suddenly thrust into the front row of a rock concert. The noise was a physical wall of sound, sirens, horns, the roar of 1,000 conversations. The scale of the buildings was inhuman, steel and glass canyons that blocked out the sun and made him feel infinitesimally small. Isabella's penthouse was on the 80th floor of one of these canyons. It wasn't a home, it was an observation deck. The view was breathtaking, a sprawling map of power and light, but the space itself was cold and impersonal. The furniture was minimalist and architectural. The art on the walls was abstract and unsettling, and the silence was as manufactured as the air he was breathing. There was no clutter, no history, no sign of a life actually being lived. It was a space designed to impress, not to comfort. It's high up, Leo said, his voice sounding small in the vast, echoing living room. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, keeping a respectful distance from the edge. Isabella came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. "Is it too much?" she asked softly, sensing his unease. "It's just different," he said, and it was the truest thing he could say. "In Harmony Creek, my garage is the tallest building on the block. The view is of Henderson's hardware store." She smiled against his back. "Well, tonight, the view will be of the city's most influential people. It's the annual foundation gala. It's for a good cause, and it's important that I'm there." She squeezed him gently, "And it's important to me that you're there with me." Which is how Leo found himself, 3 hours later, staring at a stranger in the mirror. Isabella's personal assistant, a frighteningly efficient woman named Claire, had arranged for a tuxedo to be delivered. It fit perfectly, but it felt like a costume. The fabric was stiff, the bow tie felt like a polite noose, and the polished black shoes were slippery and silent on the marble floor. He looked like he was playing the part of a rich man, and he was sure everyone would see through the disguise. "You look," Isabella said, her voice catching as she entered the room. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length gown of emerald green silk that shimmered when she moved. Incredible. She walked over and adjusted his bow tie, her fingers warm against his neck. "Just stay by my side," she whispered, her eyes reassuring. "Smile, nod, and if anyone asks you what you do, tell them you're in private consulting for specialized engine design." It's not even a lie, but it felt like one. It felt like they were hiding the most honest part of him. The gala was a nightmare of polite savagery. It was held in a grand ballroom that looked like it had been carved from marble and gold. Hundreds of people drifted through the space, their conversations a low, predatory hum beneath the music of a string quartet. The women were draped in jewels, the men in expensive suits, and everyone's eyes were constantly moving, assessing, calculating. Leo felt every stare. He was a foreign object in a sealed system, a piece of gravel in a Swiss watch. He stayed glued to Isabella's side, a faint, fixed smile on his face. He shook hands that were soft and manicured, and listened to conversations about stock portfolios, offshore accounts, and summering in the Hamptons. It was another language, and he was hopelessly illiterate. "Isabella, darling." A woman with a diamond necklace the size of a bird's egg air-kissed Isabella's cheeks. "And who is this handsome man? You've been hiding him." "This is Leo Maxwell," Isabella said, her hand finding the small of his back. "Leo, this is Beatrice Kensington. Her family owns half of the real estate on Long Island." "How nice for them," Leo said, the words feeling clumsy and foolish in his mouth. Beatrice gave a tinkling laugh and turned her attention back to Isabella, and Leo faded into the background, a handsome but irrelevant accessory. He was beginning to feel invisible when a man with silver hair and a confident, predatory smile detached himself from a nearby group and approached them. Isabella, you look radiant. Victory suits you. Isabella's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Julian, she said, her voice losing its warmth. I'm surprised to see you. I thought you'd be busy licking your wounds. Julian Thorne let out a low chuckle. His eyes, however, were not smiling. They left Isabella and settled on Leo, a slow, deliberate assessment that made Leo feel like an insect under a microscope. And this must be the man of the hour, Julian said, extending a hand to Leo. The famous engine whisperer I've been hearing whispers about, Julian Thorne. Leo shook his hand. Julian's grip was firm, a practiced assertion of dominance. Leo Maxwell. Leo, Julian repeated, tasting the name. A good, strong name. A name for a man of the earth. He looked Leo up and down, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. Isabella tells me you have a remarkable talent with machines. It's always so fascinating to meet someone who works with their hands. A real trade. Tell me, what is it you do exactly? The question was posed as genuine curiosity, but it was expertly crafted to diminish and define him. It wasn't a question, it was a label. This is what you are, a tradesman, a curiosity. I'm a mechanic, Leo said, his voice steady, refusing to use the consultant line Isabella had provided. Pride, that stubborn Maxwell trait, wouldn't let him. A mechanic, Julian echoed, as if the word were a fascinating exotic artifact. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Isabella has always had a soft spot for projects, rescuing things. It's one of her more charming, if financially unsound qualities. Isabella shot him a look that could kill. Leo is my guest, Julian. I suggest you remember that. Of course, Julian said smoothly, raising his hands in mock surrender. My apologies. I'm just so terribly impressed. He gave Leo a final, dismissive pat on the shoulder. A pleasure, he said, before melting back into the crowd. The exchange left Leo feeling like he'd been chemically burned. He felt Isabella's hand tighten on his arm, a silent signal of support, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt, his own insecurity, had been watered by an expert. Later, while Isabella was cornered by a board member, Leo tried to get some air near the terrace. He stood behind a large marble pillar, trying to make himself small, when he overheard two voices from the other side. Can you believe it? That's him. The grease monkey she flew back for. I heard he fixed her jet by hitting it with a rock or something. She's calling it intuitive genius. I'm calling it a midlife crisis. Arthur Vance must be spinning in his grave. She conquers his company and immediately picks up a charity case. The board is terrified he's going to get half of her stock in the divorce. If he's smart, he'll play along until he can cash out. It's the lottery ticket of a lifetime. The words struck Leo with a physical force. He felt the blood drain from his face. Charity case, grease monkey, lottery ticket. It was exactly what he had feared. The confirmation that in this world he would never be seen as her equal. He was just a story, a pet project. Isabella found him a moment later. Leo, are you all right? You're Polly. Before he could answer, she saw the two board members slink away from the pillar. She understood instantly. Her face hardened. What did they say? She demanded. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice flat. It matters to me, she insisted, her protective instincts flaring. I'll have them fired by morning. No, Leo said, looking at her, a profound sadness in his eyes. Don't you see? That just makes it worse. That's you, the queen, protecting her court jester. You can't fire everyone who thinks it, Isabella. The ride back to the penthouse was suffocatingly silent. The magic of their secret bubble had been popped. Back in the sterile apartment, Leo immediately began to strip off the tuxedo, pulling at the bow tie as if he couldn't breathe. Leo, talk to me, Isabella said, coming up behind him. There's nothing to talk about, he said, turning to face her. He wasn't angry. He was defeated. They were right. Look at this place. Look at you. Look at me. This is a costume, Isabella. It's not real. What's real is what's between us, she argued, her frustration mounting. Why do you care what those parasitic old fools think? I don't. Because this is your world, he shot back, his voice finally rising. This is the air you breathe. I can't breathe here. I walk in there, and I don't feel like your partner. I feel like I'm embarrassing you. I feel like you're your project. You could never embarrass me, she said, her voice pleading. Leo, I chose you, not them. He sank down onto the edge of the ridiculously expensive minimalist bed, running his hands through his hair. He looked around the cold, perfect room, then at this brilliant, powerful woman whom he loved more than he thought possible. And he felt the vast, unbridgeable chasm between them. He looked at her, his expression filled with a quiet, heartbreaking certainty. I don't belong here. Leo woke before dawn, a habit ingrained from a lifetime of rising with the sun. In the gray half-light of the New York morning, Isabella's penthouse felt even more alien. He had slept in a bed that felt like a cloud, but his rest had been thin and troubled, filled with dreams of falling from great heights. Isabella was still asleep, a fragile stillness about her that belied the formidable power she wielded during her waking hours. He looked at her, and a wave of love so fierce it was painful washed over him, immediately followed by the cold dread of the previous night. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and went into the vast living area. He wasn't looking for coffee. He was looking for an escape, but there was none. He was trapped 80 stories in the air. He picked up Isabella's tablet from a glass table, intending to look up the weather back in Harmony Creek, a small, desperate search for something familiar. But he never got that far. The screen was already awake, displaying a curated news feed, and there at the very top was a picture of him. It was a candid shot from the gala, perfectly framed. He was looking at Isabella, a slightly bewildered, starstruck expression on his face. She was smiling, but her hand was on his arm in a way that, captured by a telephoto lens, looked less like affection and more like ownership. It was an image that told 1,000 words, and none of them were the ones he wanted. Above the photo, a bold, sensationalist headline screamed in all caps, "Vance's new CO, the Grease Monkey." Leo felt the blood rush from his head. He clicked on the article. It was from a notorious online tabloid, the kind that specialized in character assassination. The piece was a masterpiece of malicious insinuation, likely fed by a source who knew exactly which buttons to push. It painted him as a backwoods opportunist who had stumbled into the lottery ticket of a lifetime. It mentioned his mother's illness, twisting his financial struggles into a motive for seducing a vulnerable, powerful woman. It quoted anonymous board members who expressed grave concerns about their new CEO's erratic and emotional judgment. Every word was designed to humiliate him and destabilize her. Leo? He looked up. Isabella was standing there, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair tousled from sleep. She saw the tablet in his hands and the look on his face, and she knew. Her expression went from soft and sleepy to a mask of cold fury in an instant. "Give me that," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. She took the tablet and read the article, her eyes scanning the text with terrifying speed. With every sentence, her jaw grew tighter. When she was finished, she didn't throw the tablet or scream. She did something far more chilling. She became utterly calm. "Claire!" she called out, her voice echoing in the silent penthouse. Her assistant appeared almost instantly, already dressed and holding a phone. "Get our head of litigation on the line. I want a lawsuit filed against this publication for libel and defamation by 9 a.m. I want to know who their sources are. And get me our PR lead. I want a counter-narrative prepared for the Wall Street Journal." The story is a brilliant CEO identifying undervalued, intuitive talent in an unconventional sector. Frame him as a genius, a savant. Is that understood? "Yes, Miss Vance," Claire said, already typing furiously. Leo just watched, numb. She was fighting back, deploying her armies, moving her chess pieces. But it felt like a war he had no place in, fought with weapons he didn't understand over a territory he never wanted to claim. "Isabella, stop," he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes blazing. "I will not stop. I will not let them do this to you. I will ruin them." "You don't get it," he said, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter if you sue them or put out another story. The words are already out there. Grease monkey, charity case. That's who I am now." Before she could respond, her personal phone began to ring. A shrill, insistent sound. She glanced at the screen, and a flicker of something surprise, dread crossed her face. She answered it, putting it on speaker. "Father," she said, her tone laced with ice. The voice that came through the phone was deep, powerful, and dripping with condescension. It was the voice of Arthur Vance. "Isabella, I see you finally made the front page of the gossip rags. A new low, even for you. Tell me, what's the next step in your brilliant business plan? Marrying the window washer? Adopting the stable boy?" "I am not having this conversation with you," Isabella said, her voice tight with rage. "Oh, but we are," Arthur thundered. "For 10 years you've tried to prove you're better than me, that your world of numbers and code is superior to the things we build with our hands. And the moment you get what you want, you disgrace the family name by attaching it to some common laborer. You haven't just embarrassed yourself. You've made a mockery of my legacy, the very legacy you stole. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me," he roared. "It proves what I've always known. You're not a builder. You're a child throwing a tantrum. End this ridiculous charade, or you will find that I still have enough friends on enough boards to make your life very, very difficult." The line went dead. Isabella stood frozen for a moment, her face ashen. The attack from the tabloid was one thing. That was business. The attack from her father was a wound, deep and personal. As if on cue, a second wave of attack began. The official company servers started pinging with emergency notifications, a dozen of them, one after another. "What is it?" Leo asked. Claire looked up from her phone, her professional composure finally cracking. "It's the board, Miss Vance. An emergency meeting has been called. The summons cites a clause in the company bylaws regarding conduct detrimental to shareholder value. The blowback was here. It was coordinated, swift, and brutal. Julian, her father, they were working together. This wasn't just a smear campaign, it was a coup. In Harmony Creek, the news spread not through digital alerts, but through hushed phone calls and conversations over picket fences. Dave brought a printed copy of the article to the garage, his face grim. "Leo, I'm so sorry," he said, placing it on the workbench as if it were radioactive. "This is disgusting." Leo looked at the picture of himself, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. It was his face, but it wasn't his life. Soon, the phone in the garage started ringing. It was Eleanor. "Leo, honey?" His mother's voice was strained, filled with a worry that went straight to his heart. "Agnes from next door just showed me something on her computer." "It's not true, is it? The awful things they're saying?" "No, Mom, of course not," he said, trying to sound calm and reassuring. "It's just city politics. It's complicated. But they're talking about our bills." "About me," she said, her voice cracking. "They're making it sound like you used me." "That's a lie," Leo said fiercely, a hot, protective anger rising in him. "You know me better than that." "I know," she whispered. "But Leo, maybe this world isn't for you. You are happy here." There was a pause, and he heard her cough, a dry, rattling sound that always made his blood run cold. I'm not feeling very well today, honey. I think the stress of it all. That was it. That was the final blow. The war in New York was abstract, a battle for power and perception. But this, his mother's health, her pain, the poison of this conflict seeping into his home and hurting the one person he was sworn to protect, this was real. He ended the call, his hands shaking. He looked around his garage, his sanctuary. It was the only place he had ever felt truly competent, truly himself. He had left it to step into her world, and in doing so, he had invited a storm into his own. He had thought he could be a bridge between their two lives, but instead, he had become the battleground. He packed a small duffel bag with a change of clothes and his mother's latest prescriptions. Then he walked over to the phone and called the one number he knew by heart, the number to Isabella's penthouse. She answered on the first ring. "Leo, is everything all right?" He could hear the stress in her voice, the sounds of a crisis room in the background. "I have to come home," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Home? Leo, no, I need you here," she pleaded. "We can fight this together. Don't let them win. Don't let them chase you away." "They're not chasing me away," he said, and the sadness in his own voice was profound. "This isn't about them anymore. My mother is sick. She's upset. This This mess you brought into my life is hurting her. I have to go home. Isabella, he started, then stopped. What was there to say? I love you, but I can't live in your world. I love you, but I can't protect you from it. Leo, please, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't do this. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt like broken glass in his mouth. I have to. He hung up the phone. He didn't take a car service to a private airfield. He walked to the edge of town and bought a one-way ticket on a Greyhound bus. As he sat by the window, watching the glittering, indifferent skyline of New York recede, he felt not like he was running away, but like he was performing a necessary amputation. He was cutting off a part of himself to save the rest. He was going home. The 20-hour bus ride was a journey through a grayscale limbo. With every mile that separated him from New York, Leo felt the frantic, high-frequency hum of the city recede, replaced by the low, familiar thrum of his own life. He wasn't running from Isabella. He was running from the man he was becoming in her world. A liability, a victim, a symbol. He had to get back to a place where his hands could fix things, not just wring themselves in helpless anxiety. He found his mother resting on the shaded porch, a patchwork quilt draped over her lap despite the warmth of the afternoon. She looked pale, the stress of the past few days having etched new lines of fatigue around her eyes. But she managed a weak, genuine smile when she saw him. You're home, she whispered, her voice thick with relief. I'm home, he said, kneeling beside her chair and taking her frail hand in his. I'm not going anywhere. For the next few days, Leo threw himself into a routine of quiet care. He cooked his mother's favorite meals, read to her from her beloved gardening books, and spent hours just sitting with her on the porch, their comfortable silence a balm for them both. He didn't touch the newspapers or turn on the television. He let the storm in New York rage without him. In the evenings, after his mother was asleep, he would retreat to the garage. It was his sanctuary, but now it felt different. The familiar tools felt foreign in his hands. He would pick up a wrench, feel its solid weight, but the simple satisfaction it once brought him was gone. He was home, but he was no longer whole. The ghost of Isabella, of the penthouse view, of the impossible questions she had asked him on this very floor, was everywhere. He realized, with a slow, dawning clarity, that his retreat was its own form of pride. He had seen the chasm between their worlds and, fearing he could not cross it, had simply run back to his own side. He told himself it was to protect his mother, to protect his own integrity. But was it? Or was it fear? The fear of not being enough. The fear of the fight. He loved Isabella, the woman, not her world. But could you truly have one without the other? Running away, he now understood, wasn't an act of strength. It was an admission of defeat. He hadn't solved the problem. He just abandoned the machine. In New York, Isabella was not retreating. She was attacking. After Leo left, a cold, calculated fury had descended upon her. The pain of his departure was a fire she channeled into fuel. She postponed the emergency board meeting, using a brilliant, legally dubious maneuver that bought her 48 hours. She didn't use the time to launch a PR campaign or to reason with her enemies. She used it to work. She locked herself in her office with a team of her most loyal data analysts and engineers. She didn't want to fight the narrative. She wanted to change the facts on the ground. She ignored the ringing phones and the endless tide of media requests. Her world narrowed to schematics, performance data, and market projections. But her focus, like Leo's, was fractured. In the quiet moments between frantic work sessions, her mind would drift. She would stare at the city lights and see the quiet stars over Harmony Creek. She would look at her hand, the one that had held his, and feel its phantom warmth. She had won her empire, but the victory felt hollow because the one person she wanted to share it with was gone. She finally understood. Her father and Julian had attacked Leo because they knew he was her vulnerability. But they were wrong. He wasn't her weakness. He was her strength, the moral compass she hadn't realized she was missing. Forcing him to be part of her world on her terms had been a mistake. She had tried to pull him into her orbit, to make him a satellite to her star. But Leo wasn't a satellite. He was his own star, with his own quiet gravity. On the third day, she did something that stunned her entire staff. She cleared her schedule, walked out of her office, and got into the elevator alone. She didn't take the town car. She didn't take the jet. She went to a rental agency and got behind the wheel of a nondescript Ford sedan, and she started driving south. Leo was in the garage, staring at a stack of schematics on his workbench. After their first night together on the jet, he had been so fascinated by the engine that he'd asked Marcus for the public access technical drawings. Marcus, amused, had emailed them to him. Leo had printed them out, initially just as a curiosity. Now, he was studying them with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He wasn't looking at them like an engineer, trying to understand the design. He was listening to them, just as he listened to an engine. He traced the lines of the fuel systems, the airflow pathways, the stress points on the turbine blades. He was searching for the engine's voice in the silent language of diagrams. And then he saw it. It wasn't a flaw in a single part, like the valve. It was a flaw in the relationship between parts, a resonance frequency. The pneumatic pressure valve he had fixed was positioned just millimeters from a secondary fuel line. According to the specs, at high altitudes and extreme temperatures, conditions met during a rapid, high-thrust ascent, the vibration from the valve could, over thousands of cycles, create a microscopic fracture in the fuel line. It wouldn't show up on any diagnostic. It would be a slow, cumulative weakness, a ticking time bomb. The stuck valve hadn't been the core problem. It had been a symptom. By getting stuck, it had prevented the catastrophic vibration from occurring. His fix had actually reintroduced the deeper, more dangerous flaw into the system. A cold dread washed over him. This wasn't just about Isabella's jet. The BR-725 engine was used in hundreds of G652 worldwide. He wasn't a mechanic who had saved a jet. He was a mechanic who had stumbled upon a potentially fatal design flaw that the manufacturer's billion-dollar R&D department had missed entirely. This was it. This was his value. Not as a curiosity, not as a grease monkey, but as an expert with a perspective no one else had. His intuitive, empathetic approach wasn't a folksy trick. It was a valid, powerful diagnostic tool. He had found his place in her world, not by changing who he was, but by proving the unique worth of who he was. Just as this realization crested in his mind, he heard a car pull up. He looked up, expecting Dave's truck. It was a dark Ford sedan with New York plates. Isabella got out. She wasn't dressed for a boardroom or a gala. She was wearing simple dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and flat shoes. She looked tired but determined. She walked toward the garage, stopping at the threshold, respecting his space. Before he could say a word, she spoke. "I was wrong," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I tried to drag you into my world, to make you fit. That was my pride, my arrogance. I treated you like a project, something to be polished and displayed, and I am so, so sorry." Leo was speechless. He had been preparing his own apology, his own explanation. "Your world, my world. They don't have to be at war," she continued, taking a tentative step into the garage. "We just need to find a way to build a bridge. And I think I know how." She stopped when she saw the schematics spread across his workbench. "What is this?" "It's your engine," he said, his voice filled with a new, quiet authority. He tapped the diagram. "And it's not just your engine. It's a problem, a real one." He began to explain, his voice sure and steady. He didn't use technical jargon. He spoke in analogies, describing the airflow as a river, the vibration as a discordant note, the potential fracture as a slow leak in a dam. He spoke the language of a man who understood the soul of a machine. Isabella listened, her expression shifting from confusion to fascination, and finally to awe. She wasn't listening to a mechanic, she was listening to a visionary. He wasn't just fixing a problem, he was demonstrating a whole new way of seeing. He had found something that her armies of data analysts, with their charts and computers, had completely missed. When he was finished, a profound silence filled the garage. Leo looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I was wrong too," he said. "I ran. I was afraid I wasn't enough, that I had no value in your world, but this is my value. This is how I can meet you in the middle. Not as your project, but as your partner." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Isabella's face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She walked over to the workbench and placed her hand over his on top of the schematics. "No," she said softly, her eyes shining. "Not as my partner." She picked up a clean rag and gently wiped a smear of grease from his cheek. as my secret weapon. Isabella Vance walked into the boardroom, but she did not walk in alone. Leo was at her side. He wasn't wearing a rented tuxedo or a power suit. He was wearing a simple, clean pair of dark jeans, a pressed blue work shirt, and the same sturdy boots he wore in his garage. He carried no briefcase, only a single, rolled-up schematic. They were not a CEO and her fiancé. They were a united front, and their quiet confidence was more unnerving to the men at the table than any outburst of anger would have been. At the head of the table, seated in the chairman's spot as if he belonged there, was Arthur Vance. Beside him, looking like a triumphant viper, was Julian Thorne. "Isabella," Arthur began, his voice booming with false authority, "I'm glad you came to your senses and returned. This emergency meeting is to discuss your fitness to lead. This board has grave concerns." "I have no doubt that it does," Isabella said, her voice cool and steady. She walked to the head of the table, Leo beside her, and stood opposite her father. "But we are not here today to discuss my fitness. We are here to discuss the future of this company's most profitable aviation contract." She nodded to Leo. This was the moment. Leo felt a flicker of the old insecurity, standing before these titans of industry. He could feel their dismissive stares, see the smirks on their faces. Then he looked at Isabella, who gave him a look of absolute, unwavering faith. It was all the armor he needed. He unrolled the large schematic on the table, the crisp paper sounding like a thunderclap in the silent room. "Good morning," Leo began, his voice calm and clear, the voice of a man who knows he is an expert in his field. "My name is Leo Maxwell. For the past few days, I have been analyzing a critical design flaw in the Rolls-Royce BR725 engine." A murmur of disbelief went through the room. Julian Thorne let out a short, derisive laugh. "Is this a joke?" Julian sneered. "You brought your mechanic to give the board a lecture on aeronautical engineering?" Leo didn't look at Julian. He looked at the other board members, making eye contact with each one. "A machine will always tell you the truth," he said, echoing the words he had spoken on the tarmac. "You just have to know its language. Your computers and simulations are looking for loud, obvious failures. They are not programmed to look for a quiet, cumulative weakness caused by harmonic resonance." With Isabella pointing to the corresponding sections on the diagram, Leo began to explain his findings. He didn't use the dense jargon they expected. He used the simple, powerful language of analogy. He described the vibration as a constant, invisible tapping on a pipe, a sound so faint you would ignore it. But over time, it creates a stress that will inevitably lead to a catastrophic break. He explained how the stuck valve on Isabella's jet had been a blessing in disguise, a random fluke that had prevented the fatal vibration from occurring. "Your entire fleet of G652nd, the flagship of your corporate aviation sales," Leo concluded, his voice ringing with quiet authority, "is flying with a ticking time bomb. It's not a question of if a failure will occur, but when." The boardroom was utterly silent. The smug expressions had vanished, replaced by looks of dawning horror. They were businessmen. They understood risk, liability, and the cataclysmic financial fallout of a fleet-wide grounding and potential loss of life. This is preposterous," Arthur Vance stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Rolls-Royce is the finest engineering firm in the world. And they made a mistake," Isabella said, stepping forward. "A mistake that Mr. Maxwell, with his unique diagnostic approach, was able to identify. An approach that this company will now formally adopt." She looked around the table, her gaze landing on each board member like a hammer blow. "I am announcing the formation of a new internal R&D division, the Maxwell Division for Intuitive Diagnostics. It will be headed by Leo Maxwell. Its purpose will be to act as an independent auditor, to look at our most complex systems not just from a data-driven perspective, but from a holistic, mechanical one. To listen to the machines. Mr. Maxwell's first act will be to work with Rolls-Royce to correct this flaw, saving this company from what would have been the single greatest disaster in its history." It was a masterstroke. She hadn't just defended Leo, she had made him indispensable. He was no longer her fiancé or her project. He was a multi-billion-dollar asset. Julian Thorne sat speechless, his face pale. Arthur Vance stared at his daughter, and for the first time the look in his eyes was not disapproval or condescension. It was shock. It was defeat. He saw before him not the rebellious child he had always belittled, but a brilliant, formidable leader who had outmaneuvered him completely. The story didn't end with a wedding, because their journey was never about a destination. It was about the act of building something new together. 6 months later, the Maxwell division was a thriving, if unconventional, part of the company. The design flaw was being corrected across the entire fleet, and Vance Industries stock had soared on the news of their innovative quality assurance program. In Harmony Creek, a new wing was being built on the local clinic, funded by the first official grant from the Vance Maxwell Foundation, a charity Isabella had established with a single, clear mission: to ensure that no one in Leo's hometown ever had to choose between their health and their pride. Eleanor, now receiving the best care possible, was thriving, her laughter once again filling the small house. The final scene is not in a boardroom or a penthouse. It's on the familiar tarmac of the Harmony Creek airfield at sunset. The G650 sits gleaming on the runway. Leo, dressed in his everyday work clothes, is standing with Isabella by the open engine housing. He is pointing to a newly installed component, explaining how it dampens the harmonic resonance. Isabella isn't just listening politely. She is looking at the engine with genuine understanding, asking intelligent questions. She has learned some of his language, just as he has learned to navigate her world. He finishes his explanation and she smiles, a real, unguarded smile. "You know," she says, "for a grease monkey, you clean up pretty well." He laughs, a deep, easy sound. And for a corporate queen, he counters, "You're not so bad at understanding what makes things tick." He reaches for her hand. One hand is manicured and powerful, the other is calloused and knowing. As their fingers intertwine, the camera pulls back, leaving the two of them standing together beside the beautiful, complicated machine that brought them together. They are not two people from different worlds anymore. They are two people who, against all odds, have built a new, stronger, and more beautiful machine together. Their life. Thank you for joining us on this journey with Leo and Isabella. We believe that the strongest connections are often the most unexpected ones. What did you think of their story? Could two people from such different worlds really make it work? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading every single one. And if you love stories that uplift and inspire, please subscribe to UpStory and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the story we have for you next week. Until then, thank you for watching.